Okay, so the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is placed sort of just above the superior pole of each kidney, and it's sort of this small triangular shaped that kind of sits right on top of the kidney. Now there are several different classes of hormones that arise, each of them really from a different zone. You can see here I have a picture here of what a cross section of the adrenal gland looks like, and you can see several different zones here. This area here in the middle is the adrenal medulla, and this area here on the outside is the adrenal cortex. Now this little diagram here kind of shows you this is the cortex, this is the medulla. Now each of these areas you can see has very different cell types. There's sort of this area of very tiny cells up here, then these long columnar type epithelial cells, and then again some sort of cuboidal cells down here, and then in the medulla itself it has a whole different cell morphology. Now each of these areas with their different cell types produces different types of hormones. For example, in the zona glomerulosa, produces mineralocorticoids, and the most common of which is aldosterone. Again, there's actually about a dozen mineralocorticoids, but aldosterone is the most common and the most important. Then the zona fasciculata, which is this large zone made up of sort of some long columnar cells here, produces the glucocorticoids. And cortisol being the most common of that group of hormones. And then there is the smaller zona reticularis, and this actually produces androgens, primarily testosterone. Now testosterone primarily is produced in the testes, but there is a small amount that is produced in the zona reticularis of the adrenal glands as well. Now the medulla, the adrenal medulla, is almost like a separate organ in and of itself. The adrenal medulla is actually made up of neuroendocrine cells, and is directly innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, and the cells actually produce peptides, neuropeptides, or norepinephrine and epinephrine. Now when these are released, when they are secreted out into the bloodstream. Epinephrine. So in the nervous system, when norepinephrine is released into a synapse, it is called a neurotransmitter. But when it's released by the medulla into the bloodstream, then it is a hormone. Same exact compounds, just different way of being released. Okay, so we're going to talk first about the glucocorticoids and specifically focus on cortisol. So I wanted to talk first about how cortisol is controlled in the body. Now remember, we talked about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and how the hypothalamus sends information to the pituitary gland the anterior pituitary gland via these nerve cells, and it sends down releasing hormones. And in this case, it's going to be releasing corticotropin releasing hormone. And it's going to release it into this little capillary bed here. And the capillary bed is going to narrow down into the portal vein, and then it's going to open back up into a second capillary bed, which is going to narrow down into another vein and go back into systemic circulation. So this corticotropin releasing hormone gets into this capillary bed, moves down through the portal vein down to the anterior lobe of the kidney, where it's going to sort of meet up with some other cells here, and these cells are going to be stimulated by this corticotropin releasing hormone to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. My pen's not working. There we go. So it's going to release ACTH, and then ACTH is going to float through the bloodstream and work its way into, it moves down into the heart and, out through the aorta and down till it works its way up the adrenal artery to the adrenal gland and into the zona fasciculata in the adrenal gland. And when it gets there, it's going to stimulate the release of glucocorticoids. Okay? And the glucocorticoids are going to spread around the body. Okay, and remember the control system here. This now we're getting a high concentration of glucocorticoids. The glucocorticoids are going to float up through the bloodstream and into the thalamus, and they're going to tell the thalamus to stop or slow down its release of corticotropin releasing hormone. And it's also going to make its way back up to the anterior pituitary, and it's going to tell the anterior pituitary to decrease its production and secretion of ACTH, right? So that's its negative feedback loop. Okay, so alright, so this is a glucocorticoid. The most common glucocorticoid is called cortisol. Now, cortisol, what is cortisol? Well, we know it's a steroid hormone. So what does a steroid hormone mean? It means that it's has a sterol group in it. It's derived from cholesterol, and it's lipid soluble. Therefore, it doesn't float very well. It doesn't dissolve in plasma, so it needs to be carried by protein. And I believe that the protein that carries it is albumin. Okay, so there's only a small amount of actual free cortisol, and it's the free cortisol that it needs to be free in order to be active in the body. So cortisol is considered a stress hormone, and it's released by the hypothalamus in response to real or perceived stress. So stress is going to stimulate the hypothalamus to release corticotropin stimulating hormone and start the process. So what kind of stress? Well, it could be hypoxia, it could be starvation, hypoglycemia, decreased glucose, or it could be hypo or hypothermia, or usually your brain is going to respond by increasing the secretion of corticotropin releasing hormone if you have an acute stress like a lion chasing you. But really, it's not going to be significant unless that, maybe if you're living next to a lion cage and, this cage doesn't look very secure to you, it's going to be sort of more of a prolonged condition. So it's really significant in periods of prolonged stress where it's more than a few seconds. So prolonged meaning, greater than a minute or two. Because the stress hormones that are important for when you're talking about times less than 1 or 2 minutes, then the stress hormones that are really critical are norepinephrine and epinephrine, and we'll talk about that later. Now, cortisol is considered a catabolic hormone, so it's the opposite of anabolic. Catabolic means that it breaks things down. So, in particular, it breaks down nutrients, proteins, fats, and complex carbohydrates are broken down into glucose. So why is that important, and what does that have to do with stress? Well, it breaks down energy that is difficult for the body to use and makes it into a form that the body can use quickly. So it kind of prepares the body for a fight or flight. So it doesn't actively support the fight or flight, but it prepares the body for fight or flight. Now, what else? What are the other effects of cortisol? It has effects throughout the body. So it has effects in the liver, and its effects in the liver include gluconeogenesis and catabolism of protein, and decreased glucose uptake, so the glucose level in the blood is higher. It also has effects in the immune system. It decreases macrophage activity. It decreases T cell activity, and it has a very powerful antihistamine effect. So it prevents mast cell degranulation. Remember the mast cell, and we're going to talk about mast cells. Mast cells are these cells that are just filled with little vesicles filled with histamine. So it blocks mast cell degranulation and prevents the release of histamine. So, and you're aware of this if you have a patient that's having a profound allergic reaction, giving a dose of steroids can be very beneficial. And it also can be beneficial with people that have autoimmune diseases because we're suppressing T cell function as well. It's a very potent immune suppressant. Now it also has significant effects on the bones. So I'm going to draw a little picture of a femur here. And if you remember your basic anatomy of a bone, you basically have this compact bone on the outside of our long bones, and this compact bone is most of the strength of the bone, and then there's a little bit of spongy bone in here, and then we have a medullary cavity in the middle that in adults is filled with fat, and then we have spongy bone up here with a little compact bone as well. Now the compact bone in the shaft of the femur is usually like 0.5 to 0.6 centimeters, or 5 to 6 millimeters. Now I had a patient who was on steroids, pretty good doses of steroids, because she had graft versus host disease after a bone marrow transplant, and for about 1 year she was on like 40 to 60 milligrams of prednisone a day. Now, prednisone is essentially a synthetic chemical that in our body mimics cortisol or cortisone, and we have a number of steroids that mimic glucocorticoids. Now she was on this for about a year, and one day I came in to do my shift in the morning, and the nurses came and grabbed me and said, "You won't believe what happened to our patient. She got out of bed and just sort of slumped down to her knees, and then she started screaming of pain. And it turns out that she had fractured her femur. And when we did an X-ray of her femur, here, actually I'll just turn this into it. It turned out that her compact bone had thinned out to about 1 millimeter, so it's about 1/5 the thickness of its usual thickness. And so she fractured her femur very easily, and it was very difficult to repair. She needed pinning, and it was, took about a year for it to become stable enough for her to bear weight again. Now, this occurs because glucocorticoids have an effect of increasing osteoclast activity and decreasing calcium absorption in the body. And so this essentially causes an iatrogenic osteoporosis. Other effects, I'm going to draw next to the liver here, a little pancreas. One of the things that it does in the pancreas is effects on the endocrine system by increasing insulin production, which again sort of adds to its main effect of increasing glucose in our bloodstream. Now it has effects on the cardiac system by it increases blood pressure, primarily through through effects on arterioles through vasoconstriction. And also, I think this is the primary mechanism. It kind of it increases the receptivity of receptors in the cardiac system on both the heart and the arterioles to respond to norepinephrine. So it kind of prepares the body for adrenergic stimulation. So if norepinephrine is released, the heart and the blood vessels are going to respond to it very quickly. And there's also effects on the reproductive system. It can cause infertility and amenorrhea and a decreased libido. Okay, moving back up here to our first picture, I wanted to talk about the adrenal medulla a little bit. So we are going to focus on the norepinephrine and epinephrine hormones. Now, these cells in the adrenal medulla are called pheochromocytes. So those of you who have heard of the condition pheochromocytoma, that is a condition where you actually get overgrowth and get a mass of these very active, overly active pheochromocytes. And it's a fairly rare condition, but it's sort of interesting when it does occur because of the effects on the body of having too much norepinephrine and epinephrine. And everybody is very familiar with the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Remember, if epinephrine and norepinephrine are allowed to float through the bloodstream, you end up with them coming into contact with the beta 1, beta 2, and alpha 1 receptors, and you end up with increased heart rate and increased inotropic response. You have decreased bronchial constriction, and you have increased vasomotor tone or increased vasoconstriction. And those effects occur by norepinephrine reaching those receptors via the bloodstream. Okay. Now, epinephrine and norepinephrine are all water soluble, so they can travel through the bloodstream without a carrier. They have a very, very short half-life of about 2 minutes, and they need a second message system for information to get from the outside of the cell into the inside of the cell. Okay. Okay. Now the other major hormone group in the adrenal medulla is actually not the adrenal medulla, I mean the adrenal cortex, is aldosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid, and its major effects have aldosterone. If there is aldosterone released into the bloodstream, it causes an increased absorption and a decreased excretion of sodium, and its end effect is to increase blood volume. And we're actually going to talk about aldosterone as part of the renin angiotensin aldosterone system when we discuss the kidneys. It's called the renin angiotensin aldosterone system, and otherwise known as RAAS. And it really has a central role in managing sodium concentration in the blood and blood volume, and it just makes more sense to discuss it when we talk about the kidneys. So that's all I'm going to discuss with that at this point. And I did want to briefly talk about Cushing's disease. Cushing's disease is a disease of primary cortical hypersecretion, and it occurs because it usually occurs because of hypersecretion of an adrenocorticotropic hormone from a pituitary adenoma. So that means there's a benign mass in the pituitary gland that is hypersecreting ACTH, and that stimulates a hypersecretion of glucocorticoid. Now, this is actually a very rare syndrome. I think I've heard. I have never taken care of a patient that has Cushing's syndrome. However, I have seen a number of patients that have Cushingoid syndrome that is caused by us giving patients steroids. And it's going to look exactly the same, whether the increased glucocorticoid activity is coming because there's a pituitary adenoma and high levels of ACTH, or whether it is present because of a person taking long-term high-dose exogenous steroids. The effects are going to be the same, and the effects are going to be what we just discussed here: increased glucose concentrations in the blood because of effects of the liver and of the pancreas, immunodepression, osteoporosis, increased vasomotor tone and heart rate, and amenorrhea and infertility. Now, the major reason that people have Cushing types of effects is because steroids are frequently given for a whole host of diseases as an immunosuppressant. So patients that have autoimmune diseases, patients that have had solid organ transplants and we need to prevent rejection, patients that have had a bone marrow transplant and we have to prevent the new graft of the bone marrow from attacking the host's body, people with asthma, people with COPD. A lot of these patients need to be on long-term steroids, and the long-term steroids is keeping them alive but at a great cost because of these long-term side effects. So even though you probably are going to be working in a specialty or a primary care practice or whatever, where you will never see Cushing's disease, you will often see syndromes that look just like it because it's very, very frequent to have patients that are on chronic immunosuppression with steroids. Okay, so that was my brief introduction to the adrenal glands and their function. And in our next video, I will be talking about the endocrine pancreas.